Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, which connects you with the world's top independent management consultants. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I am so excited to be here today with Kwame Christian, who is the director of the American Negotiations Institute. Kwame, welcome to the show.
Hey, Will, thanks for having me.
So, Kwame, you have a whole portfolio of activities. You're the author of Nobody Will Play With Me, which topped out at number 3 on, I think, the business conflict resolution on Amazon list. And you are, let me let me defer to you. Tell us about your portfolio of activities, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, it's a lot. I guess the place I should start, I should say, I'm a husband and a father, 4-year-old, and we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. And on the
Congratulations.
business, oh, thank you very much, appreciate it. Yeah, and then on the business side, with the American Negotiation Institute, I conduct negotiation and conflict resolution trainings for businesses and other organizations, help them to negotiate and resolve conflict effectively, and it's just a lot of fun for me. Really enjoy doing this work.
And your background is, I understand you worked, you're an attorney, you did civil rights work and business law, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And,
And so I did that, practiced as an attorney, and then also mediator. And I think the thing that unifies all these things, and it because right now when you kind of list through all the stuff, it sounds like it's like where does he get this stuff? How does it all connect? But I think it all comes down to my love of psychology. That was my undergrad degree. Love psychology and love, first of all, helping people to overcome their psychological and emotional barriers to success. And I think that's one of the things that kind of differentiates my approach to negotiation. I focus on helping you through the inside out. And then when it comes to the psychology as it relates to other people, figuring out what it takes to create connection and then ultimately persuade.
okay. So let's get into your work in advising, let's say, corporations and as well as the government on negotiations and conflict resolution. So tell us a little bit about conflict resolution. What are some of the types of conflicts that you might get involved in helping out with?
Yeah, so it's so interesting because it varies a lot. And so, for instance, it might be a workplace mediation. That's an example of something that comes up every once in a while. When it comes to conflict, though, internally within a company, I think that's one of the biggest things that people often miss is that we think about negotiation in terms of like an externally focused things, but the skills that I teach are most likely going to be used with the people who are closest to you. So, for example, a leader is going to have to manage conflict with their direct reports. They need to figure out what the issue is and what they can do to get them back on track and working and being productive again. Also, direct reports need to manage conflict with their leaders. They might not always agree. How do I have that conversation when I don't have that power? And then also, when you're talking to somebody on the same level, I don't have authority over them, so I can't compel them to change their behavior. So, how do I approach the conversation in a way that makes it likely for them to change their perspective and potentially behavior? So it's really diverse in terms of the application of it, and I think that's the thing that's most exciting for me because there are just so many opportunities to help people within the corporate space.
Could you give us one sanitized example of a conflict and then kind of walk us through the process that you followed? Obviously, sanitizing it of confidential details. You can change
Mhm.
the industry, change the names, but just kind of give us an direct sense of a specific example.
Yeah, and actually, I can give a specific example for one of them because it's a public organization. So, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So they are the branch of the government that negotiates the the penalties with companies who have created environmental disasters. So think about the BP oil spill. It's This is the part of the government that was negotiating with BP to see how big their fines were, and I believe that deal was, about 17 billion or some, something like that. And so the numbers that they have are pretty significant. And the challenge that they have, which is really interesting, is that of course you have the person who's on the other side, the company on the other side. So like a BP on the other side, there it's clear they want to pay less and you want them to pay more. But where it gets really interesting, and this is where the conflict resolution comes in, is internally. They have stakeholders, not just within their own organization, but they have to work with local agencies on the ground to determine what they need in order to rebuild the environment. And so there are going to be factions within those organizations who want to approach the negotiation in one direction, and the other person wants to approach it in this direction, and this whole other organization wants to do it in this other direction. So before we even get to the point where we're negotiating with that external party that most people would understand and identify as the main target of disputes, you have to get everybody else on board. And that can take weeks, months, and sometimes, depending on the complexity of the situation, even years for them. And so it's really fascinating finding ways, helping them to build coalitions and reconcile those differences between people who are on the same team.
Okay, so walk me through some of the specifics of that. So me as just kind of a naive non-expert here would think, okay, I'm going to go and interview each of the stakeholders, try to understand their situation, try to understand their objectives, try to understand, their demands, but also their objectives, what they're really trying to achieve, yeah, and then I don't know, compile that. But there's probably some things obviously that I'm missing, not being an expert at this. Tell me a little bit about the process that you went through to kind of get alignment, or at least get an understanding of the different needs of all the different stakeholders.
Yeah, and Will, let me say this too. You're not an expert in this, and what's funny is I'm not an expert in it either. I'm just good at the negotiation and conflict resolution side. So my background in law is corporate, not environmental. And so again, one of the coolest parts about this business is being able to learn so much in so many different areas, because I always say negotiation is shaped like water. It's somewhere within your organization. We just need to find it, and you can achieve success in those types of fields even without that specific knowledge, if you understand the fundamentals of negotiation. And so to your question, it's a great question. Where do we even start? How do we approach it? And I think one of the things we have to consider is sequencing of these negotiations. And so it's not just enough to use appropriate negotiation tactics. We need to use them in concert with an entire negotiation strategy so the things come together, the parts that need to come together. And so, for example, what I would suggest doing in a lot of these situations is, first of all, identifying stakeholders. We have to have a complete stakeholder analysis and figure out what it is that they need out of the situation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, once we figure that out, we have to understand that each of these parties, they have different wants, different needs, and then different levels of resistance. And so we want to identify the people who are already on our side or more likely to come to our side. And so what we do is we start negotiating with them, because maybe we have a kind of tumultuous relationship with one of the parties, but we see this other party, they don't. They have a good relationship with that third party. So what we're going to do is we're going to negotiate with our the person who's more likely to become an ally first, talk to them, get them on board, and then have them essentially be the ambassador for that third party that might be difficult. And so I think strategically that was one of the things that was missing, is understanding the power of sequencing these negotiations effectively, because it's kind of like dominoes. If you sequence it the right way, sometimes it just makes it a lot easier, if you put the parties up in the right order.
Okay. Do you operate with some kind of overarching conflict resolution framework or methodology of, the 20 different steps organized into 5 categories that you should always be thinking about? Or tell me sort of what's your model for doing what you do?
Yeah, and I like to keep it simple because it it can be very overwhelming. It's easy to get overwhelmed. And so the foundational framework that I use is called the compassionate curiosity framework. And this is the framework that I came up with for my book, Nobody Will Play With Me, which will soon be rebranded as Finding Confidence in Conflict. And so the steps of the framework are really simple, and it's intentionally simple because under duress, it's difficult for people to perform at a high level. So I want people to be able to remember it. So first step is acknowledge and validate emotions, and then second step is getting curious with compassion, and then the third step is engage in joint problem solving. And so the great part about this framework is not only that it's simple, but also that it's flexible. And so if emotions aren't an issue, then you can skip step one and get curious with compassion, start asking open-ended questions. But then if in that part of the process you recognize that some negative emotions might be taking hold, then you know that you need to acknowledge emotions. And then you can go through the process kind of linearly from there. But again, you have to end in joint problem solving, which is essentially collaborative negotiation. You're bringing them into the process, asking questions, and inviting them into the problem solving process in a way that leads to greater levels of commitment.
Now, let's go through these in a little bit more detail. So, acknowledge emotions. Tell me a little bit about how you go about that in practice.
Yeah, so very simple. What we want to do is when we see an emotion, we want to label it. And so you're using terms like it sounds like or it seems like. And so we might say, well, it sounds like you're a little bit frustrated with that situation. And then what ends up happening is when if you label the person effectively, then they feel the need to explain a little bit beyond yes. Yeah, I'm frustrated because blank. Okay, now they're sharing that information. And in the moment when they're frustrated or emotional for whatever reason, the limbic system is running awry and they're not thinking very clearly. But as you encourage them to express themselves, they start to calm down. And so, what's really interesting about labeling that I like is even if you mislabel somebody, it still works because people hate to be mislabeled and they'll correct you, which leads them to label them label themselves. And that's happened to me a few times before. And of course, it leads to a momentary spike in negative emotions. But again, it starts to eventually slow down and calm down. And then that's what allows us to transition into higher level reasoning and more productive discussions.
Okay. Now let's dig into curious with compassion. Oh,
Mhm.
unpack that for me.
Yeah. So the knowledge and information, those things are the lifeblood of negotiation. So we want as much information as we possibly can in these negotiations. That's our goal. And so the thing is, a lot of times what we do is, even though we're asking questions, and the questions might be great, our tone is off. And so that's why I'm really intentional about making sure that we remember to do it with a compassionate tone. You think about a prosecutor during a cross examination. A prosecutor is very curious, but not very compassionate. And the reason we want to do this is because we just worked hard to get them out of that emotional state with step one. We don't want to throw them back into that defensive position because now they're going to withhold emotion. Withhold information. It's going to decrease the amount of trust, and it's going to make it a lot more difficult for us to get what we want ultimately. So we want to ask open-ended questions, gather that information, and then as we start to learn more about the other side and we are able to understand and empathize with their position, then we can start to ask questions that are a little bit more persuasive in nature. And so instead of kind of making our point aggressively with sentences that might end in a period or an exclamation point, we're going to ask questions and have those statements be the things that lead people in our direction more so than making those affirmative statements. And what you'll
Give me
find,
three or four examples of
yeah.
persuasive questions.
Okay, so for example, and this doesn't necessarily qualify precisely as a question, but it's a request for information. I like to say, help me understand a little bit about what you're dealing with, right? So that's on the top end of the funnel. This is how we're introducing the curiosity portion because we want to get broad amounts of information here. Like for me as a mediator, one of my favorite questions to start off with is, how did we get here? And remember, Will, at this point, I've read the case file. I know they've been in litigation for, over a year or so at this point, but before they get to me a lot of times. And so I know. but I want to hear what they're saying because sometimes the real gold is outside of that case file, and I don't know. So I don't want to assume as though I know what it is that brought us here, and so that's how I like to begin it. So another one is tell me more about blank, whatever the situation might be, and then as I start to transition, what do you think we can do to solve this problem is a good one. And so this is where it starts to get more persuasive in nature as we start to pull toward the bottom end of the funnel where we're trying to transition into something that is a little bit more concrete, some kind of commitment. What are we doing next? I would allow them to give a suggestion. And then I'd say, okay, that makes sense because blah, blah, blah. Just summarize what they said. But then I'd say, now that is something that I've considered too. But the problem that I've run into is this. Considering that, what do you think we can do to work around that? And so what I'm saying to them in reality is your idea doesn't work. Let's try and do better. But it doesn't register that way. You know, it's accepted in a collaborative type of way that helps them to see the situation a little bit differently. Because I think about it in terms of the one of Newton's laws of physics: every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And sometimes in these difficult conversations, people are so triggered that if you make a statement that is directly challenging what they say, they feel the need to just reflexively fight back on that point.
Yeah,
And using this, oh, go ahead.
yeah, I always think it's every action has an equal and opposite overreaction.
Yeah, yes, I love that. I love that. You're exactly right. Yeah, and so what we're doing is we're avoiding that unnecessary resistance in the conversation,
Hmm.
and it makes persuasion a lot easier for both parties.
Yeah, I mean, some of mine in a more consulting context. Some of my favorites are the old chestnut of, what would we need? What would we need to believe to be true for the following X Y Z, for the following thing to happen?
Mm,
Like a sort of imagining, or let's assume that we came to a solution. You know,
I
well,
like that.
let's assume that we came to a solution 2 years from now, or 6 months from now, or 10 minutes from now. Uh, Explain to me how we got there, or explain to me where we landed. You know,
Yeah,
that's like it's sort of the opposite of a postmortem, sort of assuming that you got to success. Um, so okay, so that's step no. So curiosity, and then how do you then transition into the step three? I think that was the joint problem solving.
exactly. And so now we're focusing on the collaborative approach to solving the problem, inviting them into the process. And so a question like, what are our next steps? Where do we go from here? Those type of things. Now we're transitioning into concrete actions that will come about as a result of this conversation. And so really, if you do this well, this could turn out sounding more like a brainstorming session than anything else. And think about it. So my definition of negotiation is anytime you're in a conversation with somebody and somebody in the conversation wants something. And so it's a very broad definition, and it shows us that we're negotiating all the time. And so this compassionate curiosity framework is something that we can use at work and at home to work through these conversations. And so the people with whom we negotiate the most are the people who are closest to us. And in that, if that's the case, then we're not really approaching this in an adversarial type of way. We really are, in most of these cases, on a team with my children, my spouse, my colleagues at work. We actually are working for the same team. And so, if we are able to overcome the emotional barriers of step one and the lack of information that comes with step two, then we have enough information to work together to find a solution. And both parties should feel involved in the process in order to gain maximum commitment.
Now, you have experience, as a civil rights attorney, and you're an expert in conflict resolution. So I gotta ask you about, the current state here in the United States, where we're seeing, protests across the country about the way Black Americans have been treated by the police, and more broadly, systematic racism. Um, if you were brought in by a city or an elected official or a police department, to help on resolving a conflict in a given metro area, um, what are some of the things that you'd be thinking about? Like how can we, um, you know, what are some things that this country can do to resolve these conflicts that we're seeing across the whole country?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize that the approach would need to be a blend of facilitation and mediation. And so when I'm saying facilitation, what I'm talking about is getting various groups of people together and facilitating dialogue, helping them to express themselves. What are you feeling right now? What are your needs? What's the path forward? And so you would have those factions do that in a place that feels safe. So if I'm talking to the police, I'd just be talking to the police. If I'm talking to the Black community leaders, I would just be talking to them. If I'm talking to the politicians, I would just be talking to them too, right? And so I want them to feel safe enough to share their information with me, because from that facilitation, then I'm going to turn it into a multi-party mediation. That's the goal.
So
And
that
so
so
they
that
need to trust me.
so that first step is not like sort of an open public forum where the other parties are listening in. That's more of a one-on-one where they feel they can express themselves really openly with you, with it not being public.
Exactly. And Will, that's so important because there's still that emotional side. People need to emote. They need to feel heard and they need to express themselves. And sometimes the way that they express themselves would have a detrimental impact during the mediation. So I want them to do that with me, not during the mediation process where it's a little bit more regimented. Um, and then once I get a clear idea of the challenges every party is feeling and what potential solutions there are, then I'm going to go back with my team and think through what potential agreements could be made. Is there a zone of potential agreement? That's important. And when I mediate, I really like using shuttle diplomacy, where I go to one party alone, have that conversation, and then go to another party alone and have that conversation and take ideas back and forth. Because a lot of times when not a lot of times, essentially every time when I'm brought in as a mediator, I'm brought in because negotiations have failed. I don't need it to fail in front of me. And so I usually don't bring parties together until we get down to the point where a deal has been outlined and now we're kind of working through the details. Because usually at that point, we've overcome those really, really serious emotional barriers and people can speak in a way that's respectful and more level headed so we can be a lot more effective during that portion of the conversation.
Yeah. Do you think that all conflicts can be resolved in this way? Um, it seems that in some cases, what we're seeing across the country, there may be such different such different objectives that there almost seems like no common ground, and that some of the changes that might need to happen, that the the police may just would almost never agree to, right? I mean, changing their pensions, changing union rules, changing their accountability, and so forth. It's hard to imagine that they would, in some cases that that the parties would actually agree to those things. So, have you found cases where just conflict resolution just actually doesn't work, and that some other method of moving forward happens?
Absolutely. And here's the thing. I'm a diplomacy first kind of guy. I want to try all and exhaust all methods of peaceful resolution that are available. Direct negotiation, if that doesn't work, then we can move to mediation. And then if that doesn't work, both parties, depending, of course, on whether or not they have the legal designation of standing, if they can sue, then they have legal remedies as well. And a lot of times when you see these large social movements across the world and in America in particular, you're going to see a blend of both things happening. And so, for instance, think about the civil rights movement. Of course, there were protests. The protests helped to facilitate dialogue and negotiation between the civil rights leaders and leaders in communities and politicians. But then also, it couldn't be all done through that process. They had to have Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate the schools. in I believe it was 54. And so you try to get as much as you can through the negotiation process, and then if you feel like you need more, there are other mechanisms in place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like, and it just it feels like, and I'm not sure if this is true, that in some cases we're seeing just the parties are so far apart. It's hard to imagine people calming down enough to be willing to actually kind of discuss, rationally their points of view, or or not rationally, but just, I mean, to be able to even listen to the other side, right? In these cases, uh, and when you face situations like that, what are the things that you found that you can actually bring people to the table and get them to, open up? Is it does that result out of that first step you talked about? It, if you acknowledge people's emotions enough that you can get to that second stage.
It depends. I know that's a very lawyerly answer, but it depends on the situation. The framework can help, but sometimes the damage is so great that the emotions are still going to linger, and you still need to find a way forward. Still need to find a way to be productive during those conversations. It's very, very difficult. But I think a lot of times the voices that are heard the most are the ones who are most extreme and the ones who are the loudest. And I would go into these conversations with the assumption that something could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do believe that. And I feel like we need to earn the right to say something's impossible. That's the way I look at it. And in a lot of these situations, we haven't earned it. We have to really go through a regimented and strategic process in order to make this happen. And the thing is, we can't just let it go and hope that things happen organically. This is the way that America has developed, or organically, with structure issues with structural racism and inequity in every major meaningful category. And this is where we are. And so we can't just say, all right, well, let's let people talk it out. Let's see how the protests just eventually, die down or something like that, because that doesn't address the underlying problem that we're having within our communities. There needs to be some dialogue. There needs to be some change. And I think it needs to be up to each community to figure out what it is that they can do to start to address these structures and create more equitable outcomes.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about how your career evolved from, you know, doing civil rights law and then business law to, now being a consultant working with the, major government agencies and corporations? How did that whole process take place?
Yeah, and so it's a really interesting evolution. And like I said, psychology is the uniting factor, because for me, when I was in undergrad, I wanted to be a therapist because I wanted to help people. But then I said, well, if I become a politician, I could help more people. That's more efficient instead of just one person at a time. And so that's why I did the law degree with a master of public policy. But then as I learned more about politics, I realized that's no kind of lifestyle that I want for myself. I don't want to be part of that at all. And
What
so
turned you off about it?
I don't like the impact it would have on my family as it relates to privacy. That's just unacceptable. Also, the issues with us only having a two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's really anybody who fits squarely in either party, but we're presented as if it's a binary choice. And I think we need more options. And also the only way that we can compete in politics, unless you are independently wealthy, is to really sell your soul in order to get donations. Those donations aren't just saying, "Hey, Kwame, I think you're a nice guy. Here's some money." They want a little bit of reciprocity. And so if you get into those positions, you're not going to be your own person. And I don't like that. I like, as you can tell by my career, I like the freedom and flexibility to adjust as I see fit. And that's why I love the business world. There's the invasive level of scrutiny that would come with politics isn't there, and you can still have a massive impact on a large scale while having ultimate freedom in the business world. So that's really what drew me to business and away from politics, just more options and a better lifestyle.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so here with what I'm doing here with the American Negotiation Institute, again, based on psychology, helping people overcome those barriers, helping us to use psychology to connect and persuade. I think that's huge. And really what it comes down to is my interest at the time. I ask most of my friends this question at some point because it's the question that helped me to understand which direction I should go. And it's, if everything in the world was free, what would you do for in order to satisfy your deep needs? So of course everybody's going to say, I'll travel, I'll buy a bunch of stuff, right? That's everybody's first response. Okay, now in order to live a life with meaning, what would you do? And if I answer that question with anything other than what I'm currently doing, I know I'm on the wrong track. And sometimes that requires sacrificing a little bit of comfort. Sometimes it requires sacrificing a little bit of money. But I always want to make sure that I'm moving in the right direction for me. And ultimately, that served me well over the years.
And then, so how did you start into the consulting world and move, moving from practicing law to the consulting practice? How did that get started?
It was the podcast, really. That was it. So I started the podcast in 2016, and so it's the Negotiate Anything podcast, and it's been really remarkable to see it grow, because I did that first because I thought it would just be a lot of fun. I thought it would be so much fun to do a podcast, and then I started to see the increase in credibility, and the increase in business exposure. It's like, okay, now I'm becoming a more recognized expert in this because people can tune in and hear me talk about it. And that's really the thing that helped to be the catalyst for the rest of the career as it relates to negotiation and conflict resolution. That led to the TED Talk, which did well, and the book, which did well, and that is what I use to give myself the credibility necessary to be considered a thought leader in this.
Wow, that is a golden example. I'm always talking about telling people to start a podcast to build their credibility. So, just tell us a little bit more about that. So, you started a podcast, and talk to us about the format of the podcast. Is it just you talking and the guests that you have on the show, and how did you manage to grow the audience, and how did that lead to a TED Talk?
Oh yeah. Oh, so this is going to be fun, Will. This is going to be fun. So what I did, when you're starting a podcast, you're there talking to yourself. Nobody's listening to you. And then slowly it starts to grow. And I benefited from the fact that there were no other active negotiation podcasts when I started. Everybody else stopped eventually and moved on to something else. And so I think grit is one of those things. There's a concept called pod fade, and it's the amount of time it takes the average podcaster to quit, and it's between 6 and 7 episodes depending on the study that you see. And so if you're somebody that's just tough enough to stick to it long enough, you're going to be significantly more successful for the rest than the rest, because they don't have the grit and you do. And the best way to grow your audience is to get on other people's shows, to share your expertise for free on other people's podcasts. Because every time you go on somebody's show, you leave with a little bit of their audience. And so I've been on, I can't tell. I mean, somewhere between 60, 70, and 100, in that range of shows, and that's really really helped. And then having guests on the show and listening to the audience and adjusting when I get some feedback has been huge. I changed the name of the podcast by democratic process. It used to be Negotiation for Entrepreneurs, and then I surveyed the audience, found out that only 30% of them were entrepreneurs, and I said, well, that name isn't appropriate. What name should we choose? Negotiate Anything won. I didn't like it, but I went with it anyway, and the podcast blew up after that. So it's really interesting, adjusting and growing with the audience and taking their advice, and doing new and exciting and fun things that sometimes seem scary but work out really well. And I think the best example for that in the show is the sparring session. So this is an episode where, after a guest comes on the show and shows us a set of skills, in the very next episode we have them back on to show them how those skills look under duress. And so I try to become the embodiment of of your worst fear and act ridiculous and over the top and really difficult. And this is unscripted, and the guest needs to show the audience how they would handle the situation if they were in the under those circumstances. And then we do a kind of ESPN style breakdown to talk about what worked, what didn't work, what approaches we were trying to use, and what the listener should take away from it. So it's been really fun growing it.
And beyond just publishing the episodes, what have you done to, surrounding that to help raise visibility? Do you tweet about it? Do you post on Instagram? Do you put it on YouTube? Like, how have you spread the word?
Yeah, I've done a bad job, honestly, of that. I've been the social media that I use the most is LinkedIn, and the publication or promotion of the podcast has been inconsistent with as it relates to me. So I'm just social media isn't my thing, and so I think the problem is that I've been trying to make it my thing. And here's the thing: if as you grow, you need your company and your team needs to grow with you, even if it's just a virtual assistant. And COVID really showed me that I have a really great team because my wife's a doctor, so her job's more important than mine. So she had to see patients virtually. So when daycare was closed, I was the person who had the primary responsibility of taking care of our son Kai, and so I couldn't do everything that I wanted to do in the business. So I had to rely on the team, and I realized, my goodness, things are operating a lot more efficiently with without me in some of these areas. This is crazy, and so it made me a better business person, really. And so the posting is going to get a lot more consistent, and we're going to start mobilizing YouTube more consistently as well because we're recording via video and audio
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, and we're going to put clips and full episodes on YouTube too. And so now that it's off my plate and other people are going to be posting consistently starting in the next couple of weeks, I'm really excited to see what the growth is going to look like.
That is amazing. Yeah, I definitely encourage folks to think about get off your plate the stuff that you're inconsistent or not the best at, and tell us about your team. You know, is it one person, multiple people? Where are they? And how did you grow it? I'm always interested in how professionals have built out their teams.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and a lot of trial and error for sure. But I think you have to start taking those risks. And I remember when I was starting, when I knew I was going to transition into my entrepreneurial activities, that's when I started vetting my freelancers, my virtual assistants. And so I found a virtual assistant in Jamaica, and she's been with me about 2015 since 2015, before I even started the American Negotiation Institute. And so she's been working with me incredibly well. She knows me really well. And so you want to find somebody that you trust enough, because now I trust her enough with the passwords to everything that's important to me. And so she goes in and handles these updates and whatnot on social media, and sends emails and all this stuff. It's incredibly helpful, but you want to build your team slowly in terms of hiring on people slowly. But if you recognize that something's not going to work, you need to cut ties really quickly and move on to something that does, because you're preventing that person from finding the right opportunity for them, and preventing yourself from finding the right opportunity for you.
Yeah. Tell us about your TED Talk and what led up to it.
Yeah, so I developed this mentality that when it comes to thought leadership, at least what I wanted to do was have a three-legged stool approach. So first one is going to be a method of distribution that I am in complete control of. That's the podcast, of a distribution of my content. And then the next one is a highly publicized speech on a platform that's well respected. That's the TED Talk. And then the next one is the book. So each year, 2016, 2017, 2018, I wanted to hit those three things. So I looked at the calendar. I was like, well, it's 2017. I said, this is the TED Talk year. Let's do it. And so with TEDx, with a lot of them, you just apply. And so I said, well, I'm going to go to the TED website and apply until I get accepted. And I did that, and wanted to create a speech that was, that would solidify um, myself as an expert. But what was really helpful is that if I would have done the speech that I wanted to do, it would have been awful. It would have been terrible. The Dayton TEDx people, fantastic, fantastic team, and they really pushed me because they said when they first heard it, they said, sounds like a workshop, and I was like, exactly, that's exactly what I'm going for. A workshop. They're like, we don't do that. It needs to be good. It needs to be more personal. It needs to be a little bit more relaxed. You seem like a nice, fun guy who likes to joke, but there's nothing fun or interesting in the way that you're approaching it. And so now, if you listen to the TED Talk, it sounds like no other negotiation expert who would ever be there. It's incredibly vulnerable. It's really funny. And it took a lot of work to get there. But I had to start to become comfortable with who I am and just being comfortable sharing that with the world. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, there are a lot of other people that you can listen to. It's not a problem for me.
So, how did you get from A to B on that talk? Was it, you know, did you kind of just writing multiple versions of it and testing it with them, getting their feedback? Was there one person in particular who was coaching you on it? Like, how did you get to that final version?
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things here to mention is that not all TED programs are created equally. These are independent nonprofits, so each community can start their own with their own rules. They're just the format needs to be the same way. And I say that because the Dayton, Ohio TED Talk that I did, their team, Dayton is a military town, and they ran this thing with military precision. We had applications, paper applications. They had hundreds of people apply. They whittled it down from there to 30 people. And then they had us do auditions. And then from the auditions, they picked the people who were going to do it. They paired us with a mentor in about July. And then every week or 2 weeks, we were meeting up with our mentor and the committee, honing our content and our message. And then we had a dress rehearsal a few weeks leading up to it in September, and then another big dress rehearsal like the day before, and then eventually I think it was October 20th that we did it. Now with other people that I've talked to, they've had a vastly different type of experience because they said, oh yeah, I got the position a month beforehand. There were no mentors or anything. They just said, yep, you got it. I'll see you on the TED day. Like, wait, what? You just they just let you off to just do it by yourself? And yeah, that's how they did it. I had another friend who did one, and the audio didn't record, so they just had video, no audio. So they had to dub her sound afterwards. So if you're planning on doing one, I suggest you do some research and see the quality of content they've produced. If you look at the ones that they've put on and you're not impressed with the quality, then you want to find one that is consistently producing higher quality, because that's probably an issue with the organization more so than the individual speakers.
That's a good lesson learned. I was not aware of like how much variability, and it's good tip. Kwame, for folks that wanted to find you online, what links or sites would you like to share here? And I'll also include these in the show notes.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. Well, I should do this too. I should give your audience a bit of a gift. So if you go to americannegotiationinstitute.com/guide, you can get access to all of our free negotiation guides that will help you to prepare for your negotiations, conflict resolution, salary negotiation guide, how to negotiate for a car, how to negotiate as an introvert. We have all sorts of negotiation guides there for free. And so if you go to that website, you can get access there. And then connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to do it. Everybody who connects with me gets a personalized message from me. That's a promise that I've made and kept since 2016. And I fully intend on continuing to do that. The only thing is, I don't know when you will receive that that message, because I'm getting more and more connections now, which is great. But I really want to make sure that I show that appreciation with a response every single time.
Well, we will include both that link as well as Kwame's LinkedIn URL in the show notes. Kwame, it's been really fun talking to you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.